Good evening. You're watching AWANI Tonight with me, Farhana Sheikh. Investment, Trade and Industry Minister Tengku Dato Sri Zafrul Abdul Aziz has met with US Trade Representative Jameson Greer in Washington on Thursday, describing the session as positive. He says discussion focused on efforts to support Malaysian industries and exporters amid ongoing trade tensions.
USTR ya bersama juga dengan pihak Malaysia yang kita bersama-sama dengan semua kementerian dan agensi yang berkaitan akan meneruskan perbincangan dan saya akan berjumpa sekali lagi dengan Ambassador Greer USTR pada bulan Mei bulan depan dan insyaallah kita akan terus dari pihak pegawai tertinggi akan meneruskan perbincangan yang dibincang hari ini.
However, the minister did not disclose specific details regarding Malaysia's proposals on tariffs. The ministry later said in a statement it was open to negotiate with Washington on 4 key areas, namely reducing the trade deficit, addressing non-tariff barriers, strengthening technological safeguards and security, as well as exploring a potential bilateral trade agreement. Now joining me is Dr. Paul Anthony Maria Das from Taylor's University to unpack the outcome of the meeting in Washington. Thank you so much for joining in, Paul.
Thank you, Farhana.
Right, Paul. Now, MITI Minister Tengku Zafrul has described the meeting with US Trade Representative as positive, saying they agreed to continue further discussion. Now, what's your take on this? Where does Malaysia stand to gain from this meeting?
Malaysia stands to gain economically, strategically and diplomatically from continued engagement with the US. A positive meeting sets the tone for stronger bilateral ties which can enhance trade, attract more investment and open up new markets for Malaysian products. In particular, Malaysia can benefit from increased access for its electrical and electronics exports, digital services and sustainable palm oil. It also helps position Malaysia as a key player in the reconfiguration of global supply chains, especially for industries seeking alternatives to China. On top of that, stronger ties with the US can encourage more technology transfer, capacity building, and support for Malaysia's green economy goals.
It seems that there's a lot to look forward to with regards to this meeting. Now, MITI has said it's looking at trade deficit and possible bilateral trade deal with the US with this meeting, expected next further meeting for further discussion next month. So what possible area do you think, or specific area should Malaysia focus on for this further discussion?
In the second round of talks, I think Malaysia should prioritize discussions in sectors that align with its long-term development goals and areas where collaboration with the US can deliver the most impact. One major area is the digital economy, where Malaysia can push for cooperation in cross-border e-commerce, data governance, and digital infrastructure development. The country should also focus on high-tech manufacturing and semiconductors, encouraging US investment in its electrical and electronic sector to further integrate into global value chains. Green economy cooperation is another key area whereby Malaysia can seek support for its renewable energy transition, carbon market frameworks, and climate technology. At the same time, discussions should address market access for sensitive exports, such as palm oil and halal products, by promoting sustainability and compliance. Malaysia can also propose a collaboration on workforce development, particularly in upskilling talent for Industry 4.0, green jobs, and technology innovation. All of these areas not only benefit Malaysia's economy, but also enhance its attractiveness as a regional hub for American businesses.
Right. It seems there's a lot of areas that Malaysia can look at, especially, like you mentioned, the green sector as well, that we can explore. Now, upcoming ASEAN summits are happening, and an expected ASEAN-US summit as well next month. How can the bloc build on this positive momentum that we have right now?
ASEAN can build on this momentum by presenting a united front and reinforcing its position as a stable and attractive region for trade and investment. The bloc should focus on deepening cooperation with the US in emerging areas like clean energy, digital trade, cybersecurity, and supply chain resilience. At the summit, ASEAN can also push for a stronger support for its small and medium enterprises, sustainable infrastructure, as well as green finance. More importantly, ASEAN should strengthen regional initiatives like the ASEAN Digital Economy Framework and make clear commitments to open and rules-based trade. This position ASEAN as a constructive partner in the US Indo-Pacific strategy while safeguarding the region's economic autonomy.
Right. Now, beyond Malaysia's talk and also, at the ASEAN level, there's also the International Monetary Fund and World Bank spring meetings taking place. So what's your take on the general tone and global economic mood from Washington?
The overall tone from Washington is cautious optimism. Policymakers and economists are concerned about persistent global risk, such as inflation, high interest rates, slowing growth in China and Europe, and rising debt in developing countries. But there is also a strong push for an economic resilience, green transition, and inclusive growth. The message to emerging economies like Malaysia is to stay on a path of fiscal discipline while investing in sectors that future-proof their economies like digital, clean energy, and innovation. There is also a growing emphasis on multilateral cooperation to tackle global challenges, including climate change and supply chain vulnerabilities. Countries that can demonstrate sound governance, openness, and long-term vision are more likely to attract support and investment from global financial institutions.
Right. I mean, you mentioned fiscal discipline just now for Malaysia and also, many avenues for Malaysia to explore when it comes to, stuff that is going on right now with regards to the trade tensions. And there's plenty to look forward to. This issue is still developing. So thank you so much. That was Dr. Paul Anthony Mariadas from Taylor's University. Now, we will go for a short break. See you after this.
Dah cubalah panas terik, tapi kulit kepala masih gatal dan berminyak. Mungkin ia kelemomo. Gunalah Head and Shoulders. Berkesan menghapuskan kelemomo sehingga 100% bebas kelemomo. Head and Shoulders.
Di sini bermulanya gelombang sebenar. 18 bintang akan melakar sejarah. Membawa semangat untuk terus berjuang to conquer all. Ini bukan sekadar pentas. Inilah gelombang dominasi pertama Alpha, Big Stage Alpha.
26 April ini, penentuan juara Piala Malaysia pastinya lebih meriah dengan kehadiran Dinda Dania. Dirancangkan lagi oleh Hel Husaini, Nadira dan hos Gegar serta Sinar. Datuk M. Nasir bakal menyemarakkan lagi suasana stadium dengan Ratu Rock Negara, Ella pada separuh masa. Inilah masanya, detik yang dinantikan. Perlawanan akhir Piala Malaysia hanya di Astro.
Di dalam setiap berita yang dibawa, konteks amat penting. Kami sentiasa membawakan yang tergempar dan terkini. Pastikan Astro AWANI menjadi pilihan anda, tidak kira di mana sahaja anda berada.
Continuing our discussion, earlier we've spoke with Dr. Juwita Mohammed from Ideas on Malaysia's next steps in its trade talks with Washington and what we can leverage to move forward. Here's what she has to say.
The diplomatic discussions are very much needed. We need to be showing the US, to the US, that we're willing to work things out diplomatically. And again, because Malaysia has always been a trading partner with the US, we've had long diplomatic relationships as well with the US. So it's key for us to be keeping that relationship, especially when our supply chains are very much integrated, especially in the semiconductor industry. So we are actually party to the Investment and Trade Framework 2004 with the US. So the discussions should be based on that agreement, whatever outcomes that has transpired, it should be backed and it should be based on our initial Investment and Trade Framework 2004 agreement with the US. I am also a bit concerned that the US will try to justify their move with Malaysia's non-tariff measures that have been used not just against the US, but also with our other international partners. And these type of non-tariff measures or behind the border measures are very much related to investments, halal industry, pharmaceutical industries, and also government procurement rules. So if this is brought up by the US, then I think further discussions on how to lax or make it a bit more flexible for the US from the perspective of the non-tariff measures, I think that will need to take place a bit on the sidelines. That would need a bit more discussion. Yeah.
Juwita also highlighted Malaysia's bargaining chip in its negotiations with the US.
The US is only looking at trading goods when they look at their surplus or trade surplus or their trade deficit. But the US has its strength in services. Again, as a developed countries, you should be moving away from manufacturing goods, but then also as you grow and as you have more knowledge, then you should be moving up into the services sector. So Malaysia's bargaining chip would be to open up our services sector. This is something that we could put on the table for the US. So because this is where the US strength is, and Malaysia's strength is still in the manufacturing of electronics and electrical goods, palm oil, and apart from other industries. So again, what we can put on the table is, again, by opening up our services industry, where again the non-tariff measures or the behind the borders measures are very apparent. Again, what I mentioned before, if we are keen to keep this relationship with the US and we are willing to open up our services industry to the US, then again, the behind the border controls need to be laxed and made somewhat transparent. We need to be making the steps and the requirements more transparent wherever possible, especially in investments, in the halal industry, in the pharmaceutical industry, in government procurements, where I mentioned before, barriers are seen to be the highest in Malaysia.
Now, countries big and small are stepping up to the negotiating table to respond to Trump's tariffs. Dr. Juwita also explores how Malaysia can deepen cooperation with the US as a way forward in trade talks and how ASEAN can approach discussions with a united front.
This is like a very interesting time, I think, because you do see the dynamics between like bigger countries and smaller countries. So I don't see bigger countries like China would want to be very flexible to cater to US demands. For smaller countries in ASEAN, I think discussions on avenues of cooperation can be helpful to mend the relationship. So cooperations on critical minerals and semiconductors with Malaysia and the US can be explored if, and I only say if, it benefits the Malaysian economy as a whole and not just the sector alone. So these cooperations need to be meaningful, and it needs to go beyond, FDI numbers. It needs to empower local players through technology and also knowledge transfer. And it needs to have sustainable job creation, not just, again, numbers of job created. So for some countries, the US hostile unilateral move has caused the trust and good faith to be somewhat broken. But for Malaysia, we have always wanted to penetrate the US market, even from the time when we wanted to negotiate the TPP with the US. As a small open economy, we really did want to pursue that relationship with the US. So again, this visit is very much needed, especially for Malaysia, if we want to move the needle and repair the relationship. But again, Malaysia, we need to look inwards as well to see whether we can improve our processes for our future partners, not just the US. And again, we need to ensure that negotiations with the US can be a win-win situation. And again, it has to be beyond FDI numbers.
Under Malaysia's chairmanship, ASEAN has vowed to stand together, rejecting unilateral tariffs and committing to frank, constructive dialogue. While member states continue individual talks with the Trump administration, Dr. Juwita highlights the potential for ASEAN to navigate the issue collectively.
When you talk about ASEAN, you want to compare it with the EU, right, as a single block of production. But the thing with ASEAN, even though we are, a single regional block, we have our different jurisdictions, we're different nationals, so we're not quite like the EU at all. So again, when you think about the EU and ASEAN free trade agreements, when you think about negotiations still happen at a bilateral level with each ASEAN countries. But I think it's good that for ASEAN, we have made the statement that we're not going to increase the tariff rates, and we're going to be discussing. And again, I think this could be a foot forward in terms of, again, mending the relationship. But I don't see ASEAN as a bloc negotiating with the Trump administration. I do think that it's going to be bilateral talks with each ASEAN countries. And again, this is how we've been even with the EU. But again, theoretically, it would be easier if all of us, we have, a single voice on each product line that has the tariff increases. But again, as you mentioned before, the tariff increase is not to ASEAN as a bloc, it's like two different countries. So again, it has to be negotiated at the national level with the Trump administration. I think, again, diplomatic ties have to be kept and have to be mended. And again, as a small open economy, we might want to have the US as an ally. But I do feel that on our side, we do need to look inwards to see what kind of cooperation can lead to a win-win situation, and not just, opening up our doors just for the sake of US demands without looking into our own interests and our own social well-being.
Don't go anywhere. Stay tuned for more after this break.
Adik, kan ada Papa cakap Malaysia Madani bermula dari langkah-langkah kecil. Jangan membazir air, guna dengan bijak. Jimat air untuk masa depan.
Betul.
Guna peralatan tenaga rendah. Jimatkan elektrik, guna sumber alami jika ada. Belajar hidupkan diri. Tanam sayur, tanam buah. Kalau jadi apa-apa kan, kita ada sumber makanan sendiri. Dah ada sumber sendiri, kita masak sendiri. Jom main lagi kerja ni. Jom pergi sekolah.
Nak hidup lebih madani? Wow! Kurangkan jejak karbon kepada alam. Jom sihat dan zero karbon.
Malaysia Madani bermula dengan langkah-langkah kecil.
Malaysia sebenarnya berada di kedudukan kedua terburuk di dunia berkaitan keseimbangan hidup dan kerja.
LRT3 sudah akan mula beroperasi suku ketiga 2025. Kerja-kerja fizikal dan penstrukturan sudah mencecah 95%.
KPM sebenarnya sedang memperincikan cadangan untuk menyediakan allowance kos sara hidup tingkatan 6.
Melibat urus antara umat Islam dan agama lain penting supaya dapat mengelakkan ataupun membawa kepada Islamofobia.
Welcome back. Now, Malaysia is walking a fine line in its trade talks with the US, trying to secure better terms while keeping regional ties strong and its economy diverse, even as US Trade Representative Jamieson Greer resists calls for product-specific tariff exemptions. To give you more on this insights on how Malaysia is managing this tricky trade balancing act, we speak to Karisma Putra Abdul Rahman from Baitul Amanas.
Jamieson Greer has emphasized a firm stance of, quote, no exclusions and no exemptions. However, we also know that the Trump administration as a whole has been compromising on certain areas. For example, certain pharmaceuticals have been exempt from reciprocal tariffs. And so from this, we can infer that there is some flexibility to their position. And furthermore, that we must not forget that earlier this month, Mr. Greer himself has framed the tariffs as a strategic tool to bring countries to the negotiating table rather than as purely punitive measures. He described the tariff as part of an America First trade policy aimed at creating leverage to secure fairer trade deals. Knowing this gives us some insight into their potential playbook. So for the Malaysian delegations meetings, they can choose to view it from an alternative angle here. One that is more in line with a blank slate where everything is up for negotiation or discussion rather than Malaysia having to sing for its supper. Therefore, Malaysia can take this opportunity to engage with the Trump administration to update our deal with the US, as the last time, if I'm correct, a formal round of discussions around trade were held in 2008. So I trust that PMX and our Minister of Investment, Trade and Industry are individuals with internationalist mindsets and economic expertise. Hence, I am fairly confident that our delegation has a solid opportunity to negotiate more favorable terms.
Karisma also highlights the active role civil society and industry players can take in shaping negotiation outcomes and protecting national interests. He outlines steps on how they can be more involved in the process and ensure their voices are heard and priorities addressed.
So, as it stands, Malaysia already invites business groups and sometimes NGOs into trade talks, but the process tends to be quite ad hoc, opaque, and KL-centric. As I understand it, industry representation is fairly strong, but civil society input is still relatively sporadic. For example, in the CPTPP process, groups such as the Third World Network and a few others complain of inadequate consultation and limited tax access. Furthermore, being an East Malaysian myself, Sabahan and Sarkian CSOs note a KL bias with few state-level dialogues accompanying discussions around deals such as RCEP. So when combined with the fact that draft chapters are shared only on a need-to-know basis with hand-picked stakeholders by MITI, it becomes difficult for civil society to have an input. And so for this to improve, we can take a page out of Canada and the European Free Trade Association, or EFTA. So, for example, Canada publishes their negotiating objectives fairly early. They invite written submissions and they post a what we heard report after each consultation. So this allows the government to have the space to perform mid-course corrections and for trust building to also occur. And for the latter, so for EFTA, So during their the FTA Malaysia Economic Partnership negotiations, the EFTA Secretariat published a plain language fact sheet after it, allowing for those with broader expertise and members of the general public to understand the matters being negotiated. So this allows for more people and representative organizations in civil society to advocate to relevant policymakers on what is important to people on the ground. So these are some of the changes that the government could potentially consider to make trade negotiations a more holistic process, and in the process of doing so, safeguard national interest.
Further developments in the issue. China is considering exempting some U.S. imports from its 125% tariffs, according to Chinese media citing industry sources. A task force from the Ministry of Commerce is reportedly compiling lists of items to be exempted and has asked companies to submit their own requests. A document listing 131 categories of products said to be under consideration for exemption had circulated Chinese social media platforms and among businesses and trade groups on Friday. The list included potential tariff removals for medical equipment and certain industrial chemicals. Officials are also reportedly discussing a potential exemption for aircraft leases. However, a Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson said he was not familiar with the specifics on Beijing's plans. He reiterated that China and the US were not engaging in any negotiations on tariffs and called on the Trump administration to stop misleading the public. Beijing's possible move to broaden tariff exemptions for multiple industries follows a shift in tone from Washington, which has pushed the US dollar up slightly and lifting equity markets in Hong Kong and Japan. The US had excluded electronics from its 145% tariff on Chinese imports earlier in April. Indonesia is prioritizing its national interests in ongoing tariff talks with the US, aiming for what it calls a fair and square trade relationship. The country's delegation have been in the US since last week, negotiating the proposed 32% tariffs on Indonesian goods, which is now on hold for 90 days. While specific details were not disclosed, Airlangga Hartarto, head of the Indonesian delegation, revealed discussions covered energy supply, US market access, deregulation and technology cooperation in agriculture, healthcare and renewables. Talks also addressed Indonesia's payment system and QR code standards, viewed by the US as barriers, though Indonesia signaled openness to foreign operators like Visa and MasterCard. Indonesia has proposed boosting US imports by up to $19 billion by sourcing key commodities like wheat, soybeans, liquefied petroleum gas and crude, while offering to reduce non-tariff barriers and cut taxes on US goods. On the sidelines, the delegation met with top US officials and executives from companies like Google, Amazon, Microsoft and Boeing to discuss sectors such as semiconductors. Last year, Indonesia recorded a $14.3 billion trade surplus with the US. However, Finance Minister Sri Mulyani Indrawati warned that US tariffs could affect global growth and Indonesia's economy, but still projects steady 5% growth, slightly below the 5.2% target. In other news, South Korea and the US have agreed to develop a trade package aimed at removing Washington's reciprocal tariffs before the current pause expires in July. Seoul's delegation to the US called the first round of trade talks a good start, but suggested that the process will take some time.
South Korea said in a statement it requested exemptions from both reciprocal and item-specific US tariffs. It also offered cooperation in areas such as shipbuilding, energy and efforts to address trade imbalances. Both sides have agreed to hold working-level talks next week to determine the scope and structure of negotiations, with the goal of finalizing a package by July 8th. South Korea, which faces 25% reciprocal tariffs, was among the first countries to enter trade talks with the Trump administration. Further negotiations are scheduled to take place in Seoul with US Trade Representative Jameson Greer on May 15th and 16th, with a focus on tariffs and non-tariff measures, economic security, investment cooperation and currency policy.
That wraps up AWANI tonight. Check out our web portal, keeping you informed on the critical events shaping our world, all in one place at international.astroawani.com. That's all for now. I'm Farhana Sheikh. Thank you for watching and good night.